Thank you. Sorry that I have a little bit of a cold. I hope that would not make me less understandable. I'll try to follow from what Joanne said, and I agree with most of the things she mentioned. As was mentioned in the introduction, I was helping for 20 years Czech, or at that time Czechoslovak Human Rights Movement Chapter 77, while I was as an undergrad in England.
If people can. Maybe people can move up a little and you can raise your voice a little.
Okay, I'll work. The Charter 77 was a human rights movement, but a very heterogeneous one. That factor made it strong, in my opinion, and very attractive before 1989, but at the same time it proves to be its Achilles heel after the so-called Velvet Revolution of November 1989. The Chartists were united in their demand that laws should be respected and that human rights conventions should be implemented, that people should not be sent to prison for their political views, that there should be freedom of press, speech, assembly and association. And many argued that ethical principles should be projected into political decision making. They also all agree that the prevailing economic system before '89 was grossly inefficient and increasingly less and less able to satisfy the expectation of the people. The kind of social contract upon which the social and political order was based came under increasingly unsustainable strain. I believe that the Chartists, although it was a numerically small movement, facilitated an emergence of a rudimentary civil society. Given the absence of any permitted critical dialogue, given the absence of any genuine pluralist forms, at that time even a tiny non-conformist voice represented a major challenge to the system. What I'm trying to say here is that I believe that communism collapsed because of its own contradictions, and that the internal factors in these systems were much more decisive than the alleged pressure of the West, combined force of Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, or the superiority of liberal capitalism. In my opinion, my friend Dick Howard of Stony Brook University was right when he argued that the East European changes were revolutionary in the sense that they enabled to pursue democratic policies of rights. There was no Fukuyama's end of history, and there was no decisive victory of liberalism, at least not in '89. Most of the population, including the dissidents, and I would stress here, including at that time, the playwright and future president Václav Havel, did not wish to see the return of capitalism. In fact, in his first speech on the new year of 1990, when he was president, he very strongly argued that the communist propaganda that he wanted to see the restoration of capitalism was total nonsense, and he argued that he would preside over the victory of social justice. Up to his death, many of us in frequent confrontations frequently quoted that speech as an illustration of his major change of mind, to put it mildly. There was no consensus, of course, at the time as to what system we wanted to implement. And all proposals made in 1989 and 90 were marked by lack of experience, by naivete, by wishful thinking. And there was a great fertile soil for illusions. I recall my friend, the late Jiří Dinsbier, who became the first post-89 foreign minister, who in one of the meetings held actually here in New York, argued that the Cold War was won by the civil society. A great illusion. An illusion which stemmed from the fact that a number of dissidents became overnight government ministers. But only 2 years later, the dissidents began to understand that what Havel called the power of the powerless was quickly replaced by the powerlessness of those in power. And anyway, all the dissidents, with the exception of Havel in the Czech Republic, were removed from all positions of power by 92. And the real power shifted to the financial oligarchy, to Western banks and Western very well paid advisors. Under the official slogan that past injustices have to be set right, a major privatization unfolded. Supporters of capitalism, such as the then finance minister, Václav Klaus, today still the president, warned that the economists and managers should not be slowed down by lawyers and by those who wanted to agree on set of rules preventing laundering of dirty money, widespread corruption, and so on. He argued that this would slow down the victory of capitalism, and many people went along with it. Not all of us, I would say, even then. Most of our countries were quickly and successfully incorporated into a variety of regional and global Western-dominated structures and institutions. The communist past was rejected wholesale. The right-dominated media helped to discredit ideas of socialism and even attempted to criminalize it. In some countries, including the then Czechoslovakia and later Czech Republic, a real witch hunts unfolded. I would say reminiscent of the US McCarthy area. Interestingly enough, the real targets of these witch hunts were not former Communist Party officials. Many of them argued that they never really believed in communism. They introduced this interesting differentiation when they argued, I was member of the Communist Party but not a communist. The targets were former dissidents who actually remained convinced socialists. Psychologically, this was understandable. I actually remember many people asking me how it was possible for me to escape from communism, go to England, join the Labour Party, and become critical of Maggie Thatcher, when the Iron Lady, in fact, led the courageous and victorious struggle against the evil communists. It didn't make sense. Such absurdity could only make sense to people if they could be shown that all the time I actually acted under the instructions of the Communist Secret Service. So the conspiratorial way of thinking clearly prevailed. And there was an increasing number of articles suggesting that the Charter 77 in fact was infiltrated by former communists as well as by Secret Service agents such as myself. This idea reassured those who conformed to the regime before '89 that in fact it's not true that they were cowards for not supporting Charter 77. In fact, they were extremely clever because they've seen through the camouflage. It helped them to obscure their own complicity in maintaining the regime. And it obviously helped them to feel much better about themselves. By '92 elections, most dissidents, as I said, were removed from positions of power, but the same, not quite identical, but very, very similar developments you've seen in Hungary and in Poland, so this is not just a Czech specialty. Illusions were fostered kind of a forms of capitalism which has not been known in the West since the 19th century. And there was an illusion that this kind of laissez-faire, wild capitalism would actually very quickly lead us to prosperity. The desire to cut the countries off their Soviet past led to what I would call unconditional embrace of everything Western politicians and Western investors suggested. So I would agree that the great expectations of November '89 were never really fully realized. I actually remember being interviewed in December '89 by John Simpson of BBC, and I then estimated that what we are in for is a period of what I then called Thatcherism with a human face. In fact, the human face. What we then experienced was a disillusionment, a gradual disillusionment with the so-called shock therapy at the time proposed by Jeffrey Sachs, who's now talking differently, but that's another matter. And which was then happily implemented by Czech Friedmanite and Thatcherite Václav Klaus. In fact, Václav Klaus in Chicago in his speech some years ago proudly declared that he's the last Thatcherite on the continent of Europe. I then believe that after this disillusionment, which was inevitable after several years of Thatcherism in human face, we would be presented with some kind of social democratic alternative. This became partially true in the Czech Republic in 1998, and similar development again took place in Hungary and Poland. However, the new social democratic governments, and I was a member of one of them, proved incapable to deal with the issue of systemic and widespread corruption. People became very cynical about politics and politicians. Today, I would argue that what we witness is a profound crisis of governability. There is no functioning real participatory democracy. There is no real social justice or meaningful solidarity. The most important decisions are dictated by financial oligarchs. The rights of the trade unions are gradually curtailed. The burden of the state indebtedness is passed on primarily to old age pensioners and to ill people. Democratic policies are under increasing pressure. The most frequent explanation is voters' apathy, decline of political parties, or the influence of money on politics. But I believe there are deeper causes. One can talk about what I call privatization of state and politics. The gradual merge of political parties and economic interests, frequently supported by global capital, leads to systemic corruption and privatization of state roles, pension systems, education, health service, security, etc., into the hands of powerful private groups. Democracy has to be understood in many, if not all, post-communist countries is still very fragile. There is a very low level of political culture. Given a certain overstatement, it can be said that it is a democracy without democrats. Such an immature democracy is not able to protect itself with sufficient antidotes such as public sphere, civil society, i.e. institutions independent of politics, and thus the state is under increasing pressure from what I call merged economic and political mafias. And among members of these mafias are frequently former top communist managers who have turned into militant anti-communists, and soon after '89 became multimillionaires and fervent capitalists. So understandably, people view this development with increasing cynicism. People today do get angry when they see governments responding to financial crisis by A, ordering cuts in expenditure of the welfare state, B, reducing unemployment benefits, pension, social benefits, etc., C, tolerating corruption that siphons off billions by manipulating government commissions, and so on. All successful Czech banks are in fact foreign-owned. And people watch, therefore, with certain disgust how Western governments pour taxpayers' money into banks, while bankers continue to live in great luxury. The explanation that some banks are too big to fail and that they cannot be allowed to face bankruptcy because as global financial markets they can take down entire states or even the Eurozone, only fuels the anger of the people who know that these powerful markets are not under any kind of political control. In Eastern Europe, this feeds into a great anger against the European Union. In fact, today, especially in the Czech Republic, and this anti-EU feelings is encouraged by emerging nationalist politicians and extremist rightist groups. Democracy as a set of formal processes and institutions that enable human beings to truly participate in the political sphere in the pursuit of their interests, I believe does not work, at least not in the Czech Republic or Hungary today. Post-communist East European countries have been able quite easily to establish formal democratic institutional framework, organize free elections, etc., in short, to fulfill Copenhagen criteria. However, to develop a democratic political culture in which the values of democracy become rooted in people's mindsets and reflected in their behavior, that is proving extremely difficult. Raoul Dahrendorf several years ago estimated that it will take about 60 years to achieve that, and I'm afraid that this was an over-optimistic guess. It is not that the impact of civil society development has not produced what I would call a kind of substantive democracy. Substantive democracy which enables citizens to exercise some real participatory power. But in fact, a widespread corruption, in my mind, undermines the entire functioning of democracy. People have not internalized democratic values. So in this atmosphere, it is extremely difficult to establish a rule of law, where people would respect laws because they are fair and correct, not just because it's in their interest or because they are afraid of punishment. So this part I will conclude by claiming that democracy is under siege. Today we are witnessing a large number of demonstrations in my country, where it's highly unusual, but primarily Romania, Hungary, and so on. Many, in particular young people, protest against austerity cuts and what the governments call reforms. But in fact they condemn all politicians, government and opposition alike, claiming that they are all corrupt. And they in fact, and John mentioned the term anti-politics there, and today I think it's even less constructive than it was when Havel coined this phrase in the late 1980s. Today, anti-political politics is the result of deep disillusionment with democracy and the unfulfilled promises of '89, by resentment provoked by the destruction of social state and by corruption scandals, etc. The development opened space for the emergence of new populist and nationalist groups, and I would say even extremists with a kind of brownish coating. At the same time, a space is open for new civic initiatives on the left. But civic initiatives which are very skeptical of the established leftist parties, the Social Democratic Party or the Communist Party. They are encouraged by, for example, the US Occupy Wall Street movement or by the Spanish Indignados, much more than by the Arab protesters. And there's no time, and I was already warned about the remaining 5 minutes, to highlight why I see the major difference between the Arab, so-called Arab Spring, which some of my Arab friends call the rejuvenation of Islam, rather, and the 1989 movement. Today, these civic initiatives do actually say they feel as an integral part of what here you call the 99%. But these protests are also marked by great degree of inexperience, disorganization, and naivety. And ironically, while they employ radical terminology, they advocate policies that I can describe as reformist. They stress the need to renew their own identity on the basis of old ideas of freedom, equality, and solidarity as fundamental ethical values. And they quote from the late Tony Judd's book, Ill Fares the Land, to stress that attitude. They strive for old values to be implemented by entirely new model. Therefore, not for just cosmetic changes of the current model of capitalism. But they are not clear how this new model should function. So let me finish by describing the difficult dilemma these groups are facing. First, they have a choice between first to work with other civic initiatives towards a future major movement for change, but at the same time risking that they will fail to get into the streets hundreds of thousands, let alone millions. And if there are small numbers, the governments will ignore them. A tiny army without influential generals will be only of nuisance value. Or secondly, to pragmatically cooperate with parliamentary leftist opposition parties, placing them under constant pressure and keeping them under certain permanent public control, and then jointly bringing about the desired change. This, of course, leads to an obvious risk that a close cooperation with these parties can lead the activists into being imprisoned in an embrace with the corrupted system. And this would provide a green light to the radical right-wing populist groups. And I believe that would be highly regrettable. So let me conclude by sharing with you my own dream. I remember many years ago I was on a platform with Joanne Landy here, and I also tried to describe my dream. Given my old age, I may be allowed to continue to dream. I would like to live in dignity, in a healthy environment, in peace and security, in a world free of hunger, repression, and wars. And I believe that for this dream to become true, we have to target extreme poverty, injustice, oppression, ignorance and intolerance, exploitation and manipulation of the people. I believe that people, groups and institutions who share the same values and convictions are a part of a global civil society, which today, in a world of far better communication than existed during the Cold War, can play an important role. I believe that the impact of our activities is unlikely to change the world tomorrow. That would be naive. Dream castles in the air are dangerous illusions. I am, however, convinced that if we are consistent and determined to persevere, then we could decisively contribute to what I describe as a long, drawn-out process of the necessary political change. And that is, in my opinion, definitely worth an all-out effort of all decent people who can. Thanks very much for your attention.